Hi Algebra 2, this is Mrs. Cowles, and today we're going to do just a quick review of some Algebra 1 skills of simplifying radicals. So a radical is any expression with a square root, a cube root, fourth root, etc. The symbol for a radical sign looks like this. Now what I want you to do is list the first 20 perfect squares, and you should remember that a perfect square is any number whose square root that you take is a whole number. So our first perfect squared is going to be 1 because 1 squared gives us 1. So I'm going to underline the perfect square. We're going to list the first 20. We're going to do 2 squared to give us 4. 3 squared will give us 9. So 9 is a perfect square. 4 squared will give us 16. So let's list the first 20 of those. 5 squared will give us 25. 6 squared will give us 36. 7 squared gives us 49. 8 squared will give us 64. 9 squared will give you 81. 10 squared is 100. 11 squared is 121. 12 squared should be 144. 13 squared will give you 169. 14 squared will give you 196, and I should underline the 169 in there. 15 squared will give you 225. 16 squared will give you 256. So 256 is perfect square. 17 squared will give you 289. 18 squared will give you 324. Then we're going to have 19 squared give you 361. And then 20 squared is equal to 400. Okay, so really knowing the first 15 is really important. If you can get up to 20, learn, that will be helpful as well. But I definitely recommend the first 15 are memorized. So today we're going to simplify radicals. And if our number is a perfect square, it's really easy to do because all we have to do is take the square root of the number. So for example, if I give you the square root of 49, 49 is a perfect square because 7 squared takes us back to 49, and 7 is our whole number. So 7 is the square root of 49. 225, again, you look up at your list. 225 is a perfect square because 15 squared gives you 225. So the square root of 225 is 15. Now let's take a look at the next one. This is 2 times the square root of 144. And again, 144 is a perfect square. You should know this, but the square root of 144 is 12. So this really breaks down into 2 times 12, which will give me 24. Now, if we have a fraction where it's both under a square root, that means you take the square root of the numerator and the square root of the denominator. And they are both perfect squares, so we can break that down as to 2 over 3. As we continue and we take a look at the next one, we see that we have the fraction 36 over 121. Both 36 and 121 are perfect squares. We see them in our list, but you should know those as well. So when I take the square root of 36, that breaks down to 6, and the square root of 121 breaks down to 11. Now let's take a look at question number 6. Question number 6 says, take the square root of 112. Well, you should know that 112 is not a perfect square. And if you take a look here, we see that 112 falls between 100 and 121. So when I would take the square root of 112, it's going to fall between 10 and 11. But I don't want a decimal and round it off. I want you to break down the non-perfect square. So here's the steps. You're going to break the radical down using the largest perfect square. So I'm going to look for the largest perfect square that goes into 112. So instead of starting down here at 1, since I want the largest, I find the first largest perfect square that's smaller than 112, and that's 100. And I start with 100 and I go down my list to see what is the first largest perfect square that goes into 112. If you start in this direction, you'll be able to stop as soon as you find the perfect square. If you start with the smallest perfect square, you may find a smaller one and there could be a larger one that exists. You have to keep going. So the strategy is to start at the first largest perfect square, smaller than 112. Well, obviously 100 doesn't go into 112, neither does 81. 64, if you double that, it's 128. 49, does 49 go into 112? No, if we double that, that's 98. Does 36 go into 112? You can try dividing that out. 112 divided by 36. That does not go into 112. 25 obviously does not. Does 16? If we divide 16 by 112, it does. Okay? So we can break this down into the square root of 16 times 7. So you find the largest perfect square that goes into that. If you had started at the other end and you started at 1, you would have found 4 goes into it, but you will get 4 goes into it 28 times, and 28 can still be broken down. So that's why you want to start with the largest side on the larger end, because this way you'll have to do less work. So now all you do is you basically are breaking this down into the 2 square roots. I can take the square root of 16, that's equal to 4, and the square root of 7 does not break down any further, so I am left with 4 root 7. So you can pause the video and try the next one, or you can just continue to work with me. So try to see if you can break down the square root of 245. Again, 245 is not a perfect square, but as I go up to my list, I see 225 is where I start. Obviously, 225, 196, 169, 144, 121, 100 are not going to go into 245. But does 81 go into 245? You can try it, divide it out. 245 divided by 81, it does not. We keep going. 245, we can divide that by 64 and until you find that. So you're going to keep dividing it out. Oh, we found it. If you continue to divide it out, you're going to find that it's 245 divided by 49 will give you 5. So you break that down. Square root of 49 times 5. Now if you want, you can just break that down right away into square root of 49 times square root of 5. You can break it up into the 2 square roots, and this will break down into 7 times the square root of 5. Now again, we saw this earlier. If there is a coefficient outside the radical, you will multiply this number by any number that you break out of that square root. Okay, so we saw earlier when we had this 2 times square root of 144, that just became 2 times 12. So I want you to go through and break down 72. Now a lot of you are going to say, oh, 9 goes into 72. But again, if you start at the higher end, you're going to find that 36 will be the first square root that goes into 72. So this breaks down into 5 times the square root of 36 times the square root of 2. Okay? Because once again, we see that we have 72 divided by 36 is 2. So this becomes 5 times 6 times the square root of 2. So whatever breaks out, the 6 you're going to multiply by the 5, and that becomes 30 root 2. So try the last one. 45, you should know that that's going to break down into the square root of 9 times the square root of 5. Now when I break this down, this becomes 9 times 3 times the square root of 5, and this breaks down into 27 square root of 5. It's important that you understand this skill because as we get into quadratic formula and solve quadratic functions using the quadratic formula, you will have to break down radicals. Have a good night.